Fundamentally, that they depend more on us than we depend on them, I think is a realization we have to make. The rise of China does not really continue without access to Western markets, Western capital, and Western technology.
Jonathan Ward is a China scholar, founder of the Atlas Organization, and author of The Decisive Decade, American Grand Strategy for Triumph over China.
It's not just an economic contest. It's not just a military and diplomatic contest. It's a contest for what sorts of beliefs and possibilities lie ahead of humanity in the 21st century.
What are the key strategies that the U.S. must deploy economically, diplomatically, militarily, and ideologically to outmaneuver the Chinese Communist Party? This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kellick. Jonathan Ward, such a pleasure to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Thank you, Yan. Good to be with you.
I have really enjoyed reading your book. Congratulations on a book that is, trying to outline a strategy for how to deal with the Chinese Communist Party. Tall order. And you bring a lot of different pieces of the puzzle together in a way I haven't seen before, and I'm very excited to talk about it. Before we go there, you talk a little bit about ideas as being one of the realms of competition, right? Or perhaps even warfare. And you use these quotes at the beginning of that ideas chapter. You mention Bono actually said that America is one of the greatest ideas in human history. Like, that's how it's viewed from the outside. I don't know what year that was. It was a little while back. And then also you said this: be the America that Hong Kong thinks you are. Interesting. So what prompted you to use these quotes to lead off this chapter?
Sure. So the book is broken into the classical arenas of Western grand strategy, so diplomacy, information, military, and economics. And initially, I was basically going to focus on economics and military, the two most important strategic arenas for this contest. But eventually, I thought, why not do the whole thing and include the arena of ideas, which became the most challenging part to write, and in many ways the most exciting part to write. And I set it up with the two quotes, one from Bono, the Irish singer and leader of the band U2, which was the first CD I ever owned as a child. And he had this beautiful quote that I remember from many years ago. He said, "America is an idea. It is one of the greatest ideas in human history. That's how we see you in the outside world." And then something I saw on Twitter during the Hong Kong uprisings in 2019, where it said, "Be the America that Hong Kong thinks you are," with pictures of students waving the US flag. And part of that to me was based on my own background, which is somewhat international. I spent about 11 years overseas between the travels I did learning foreign languages, the PhD I did at Oxford studying China-India relations. The future of the United States is not just important for us. It's important for the entire structure and well-being of really all of humanity. So much depends on the success of this nation. And I think our example resonates far beyond our own borders. It always has, and it still does. So I chose those two because I think they're contemporary, they're earnest, and I think we need to see how important this country is to the world. It's not just for our own destiny, but really for the whole picture. America as the geopolitical bedrock, the guarantor of human freedom, of prosperity. These sorts of things that I think we had a clearer idea of in the past when we understood what the free world was, what it meant, when we understood what American leadership was. It's not just an economic contest. It's not just a military and diplomatic contest. It's a contest for what sorts of beliefs and possibilities lie ahead of humanity in the 21st century. And geopolitics to me is, that's why it matters. It depends, it matters who wins these contests when they arise. And in this case, it matters a great deal that the United States and our allies continue to be the main force in power, economic, military, and otherwise, and that we continue to lead in the 21st century.
So we find ourselves at a very interesting time in history, and actually you make the case in the book. You call it the decisive decade. This is the decisive decade in your view, and I think you argue convincingly to figure out how to deal with this geopolitical threat of the Chinese Communist Party, not just for the benefit of America, for the benefit of the free world as we know it. Some people out there believe that it's actually already over, that China's already won, that even that ideological system is going to be dominant, right? And so I guess I want you to come in from two sides here. One is, how do we know that's not the case, right? And number two, why are you so sure that we can turn it around.
Right, and so I talk about this in my first book, China's Vision of Victory, which was probably the first book to explain the long-term strategies of the Chinese Communist Party in their own documents, and I'd been spending a lot of time with primary source for various reasons prior to writing that. But here, the point being that they have a set of time frames that to them are both symbolic but also planning time frames. They have the symbolic date of 2049 when the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation would be complete. They have the symbolic date of 2021, which is past now, which is the centennial of the Communist Party of China, and they sort of see this in a time frame that goes out to the mid-century, and at that point China has risen. But for me, in analyzing this and realizing that for the United States to wake up and take action, it really matters that we use the 2020s. I mean, this will be a long-term contest. It will stretch out most likely for the foreseeable future, but we have these advantages that we cannot relinquish, and I think that's one of the most important pieces here. I mean, the United States, particularly when it comes to economic power, which is I see it as the basis for the Communist Party's approach to geopolitical power. I mean, they have a bunch of economic strategies that are designed to place themselves at the center of the world economy and to increase the world's dependency on China while at the same time reducing their dependency on the world, to convert that ultimately into military power, diplomatic power, as we're starting to witness, but then to get that going in such a way where they're an unstoppable force. But the U.S. is still, I mean, we've been the largest economic power for well over 100 years, and that is a great deal of our geopolitical history is defined by that, by having this preeminent position in the world economy. When I was writing the first book, I had to continuously revise upwards the share of GDP that the People's Republic of China was in relation to the US, because it kept growing every year as I was writing the book. And today they're about 80% of our gross domestic product. So, we have to take this moment, particularly in the 2020s, to ensure that we're the largest economy in the world, that we have real economic strategies that will ensure that, guarantee it for the long-term future, and also to rebuild peace through strength, which is dependent on economic power. That's how we've been able to win wars in the past when we're forced to fight them, and to maintain peace when we're able to do so, which is our preference. And also to have the diplomatic structure of the world be one that is heavily in favor of the US, our allies, the other democracies in the world, and one that's essentially not going to be overcome by Russia and China at this point. I mean, there is a bit of an axis here of authoritarian states. So we have all these advantages today, but we're losing them. I mean, we're watching our position in the world economy be challenged in meaningful ways across strategic industries, critical technologies, global markets. It's not guaranteed unless we have real strategies to back it up. And in the 2020s, if we're able to cement our most important positions, if we're able to utilize what's coming in economic history, which is Industry 4.0, which will create new productivity, increases, new industries, all sorts of things that could be a major boon for the U.S. and the alliance system. If we're able to do all that in this decade and get that started, get a real grand strategy in motion, I think we will be in a much better position for as long as this contest goes on. So we have to take the moment that we have.
So one of the things that you talk about is, from different angles, is kind of how the Chinese economy is structured. You describe it as an investment economy. It's based on using U.S. capital markets quite a bit. You also talk about how a lot of their economic growth is not productive necessarily. Let's actually understand that. That's something that you've taken a very close look at. How does that work? I mean, it's 80% of the U.S. GDP, yet it's incredibly dependent on the U.S. to this day. How does that work?
Well, look, it's dependent a lot on exports and government investment. I mean, they've been trying to create a consumer sector, to do that and have it be consumption-led. That has not gone, I think, as well as they would have liked to date. There's still possibilities for them, but they are, I think, losing a little bit of the ability to create productive investment-driven growth. So that's something that is going to be very important, because as the debt overhang becomes more important, as that begins to harmonize with demographic issues, it's going to be their ability to interact with the global economy that allows them to continue to grow and continue to have, advantages in the international system. So they're focused on strategic industries. I mean, that's one of the key drivers. They've got industrial policies that we've all become acquainted with at this point. Made in China 2025 is the most famous one. It identifies about 10 strategic industries that are targeted for investment and also intellectual property theft. I mean, things where they can build, state-owned or state-backed super companies that can go out into global markets and compete with our own companies companies with enormous amounts of capital resources behind them. So there's that side of it. And then there's the ability to generally interact with the global financial system. So the rise of China stepping back is really the story of U.S. engagement. I mean, in access to our markets, I mean, we're still the world's largest economy. We've been the largest demand center in many cases. I mean, our sort of demand for imports from abroad created, an export sector in the People's Republic of China that could help drive and fuel their growth. So you have that, and then access to our capital. I mean, being part of a working global financial system, being invited in all the important ways. And then not least of which is technology transfers. So the classic deal during the last couple decades of the rise of China, especially in the early 2000s and sort of 2000s, 2010s, was a technology transfer for market access deal, joint ventures, those sorts of things where very advanced technologies would wind up in the hands of Chinese state-owned or state-backed companies and essentially allow this massive technological advancement across the board that we did very little to control. And we're just starting to see not only the US, but also allies get into the business of restricting exports. I mean, this began really in the last 5 years. Outside of purely military sectors, we've started to look at, the broader civilian economy. But from, the sort of Communist Party perspective, I mean, the civilian and military economies are quite linked. I mean, civil-military fusion expresses their ambition to bring civilian industrial innovation into the military sector and basically to pull it all together so that they have what they call comprehensive national power and are able to compete with us both in terms of military modernization, key strategic industries, emerging technologies, all the rest of it. So, for us to be able to push back on all that, I mean, realizing fundamentally that they depend more on us than we depend on them, I think is a realization we have to make. I mean, certain sectors, certain companies are overexposed to China. A lot of that, good corporate decision-making, de-risking, that sort of thing will help us to reduce that kind of exposure. Government has a role to play in that certainly as well. But fundamentally, the rise of China does not really continue from an economic perspective without access to Western markets, Western capital, and Western technology. And that's not only us, it's the alliance system. You take NATO alone and it's half of global GDP. You take the world's democracies and it's over 60%. When you get into global wealth, we're at about 75% of all of that. So we're still the bulk of world GDP as an alliance system. And if we're able to establish best practices on market access, on capital investment, and on technology transfer across the entire alliance system, we would slow down their game very, very much, very quickly. And if we're doing that in the 2020s, we're going to be competing against a state that's not continually rising and innovating and sort of becoming more capable, but one that's starting to stagnate and create a geopolitical contest in which we can accelerate, we can gain new advantages, we can compete them in the long run and really eventually begin to win the entire picture. So a lot of this is resolved in the economic domain, and that's where we need to focus most. And it's also where we lack real strategies and real theories of victory.
Well, and this is one of the things I really loved about your book, where you make your very clear understanding that economics is the key area of actual warfare, even as much as there is this military dimension, right? But economic strength will do even more to guarantee that peace than just military strength.
And it's both. I mean, you need to get those two pieces right fundamentally. I mean, a good, sound economic strategy of victory coupled with a military strategy for real deterrence. I mean, you have to get deterrence right if you're going to do what I call economic containment in the book. I mean, there are two pillars to it. One is economic containment of the People's Republic of China, and the other is rebuilding, reindustrializing the United States and the alliance system. So if we're able to focus on ourselves, make ourselves stronger, and at the same time, yes, we are going to have to slow down the adversary. It doesn't help, as I say in the book, sort of bumper sticker style. I mean, if you're driving your car faster and the adversary is sitting in the seat next to you, it doesn't really matter how much faster you drive. So we have to do both. We have to start kicking them out of the car a little bit, and at the same time focusing on the accelerants that we can get through what's going to be a very exciting period in economic history ahead. But if we do this as a joined economy, I mean, Elon Musk called it co-joined twins, then our gains are their gains, our advantages become their advantages, and their advantages, which are used for strategic power, really have a far greater ability. So we have to utilize the fact that we are poised to do some exciting things in economic history, and we're going to have to go there without bringing the adversary along with us. And that is going to require certain containment measures that we have precedents for all this. I mean, throughout the Cold War, even the Second World War, even further than that, there's a pretty large policy toolkit, but I think we have to have some clarity of vision on what to do.
It's hard to imagine when you consider the level of integration right now that the Chinese regime has into the global economy, and how much, I mean, even just investment dollars, just even through the indices that are going in there, you know, kind of automatically, right? It's hard to imagine how to extricate oneself out of that. You have all these, you know, very large American corporations. You actually frame it this way: the U.S. multinational versus the Chinese state enterprise, right? Well, the Chinese state enterprise clearly are following the direct decision making from the Chinese Communist Party, from Xi Jinping. Ultimately, the U.S. multinationals have their own agendas, have their own interests. And some of those don't necessarily align with the American idea as you describe it. In fact, in some cases, they don't care about that anymore. So how do we deal with that?
Sure. So I think this is in many ways the nature of the game at this stage. I think the important thing here is to work through those problem sets and to begin to restructure the global economy so it depends far less on the People's Republic of China for as long as the Communist Party or anything like it is in power. So that's really what we have to win in the 10, 15-year period ahead of us. Maintain deterrence and start to restructure the economy. So we're going to have to work through this, sector by sector, company by company insofar as they matter, technology by technology, market by market, and start to come up with a world in which we are outpacing them across the board. And I think that can be done. And as you've just referred to, and one of the big subjects of the book is the role of major companies in U.S.-China competition, because at the end of the day, economic power is built by business, by commerce. I mean, that's really fundamentally what it is. And especially in our own history, and this is one of the things that I found most exciting to study as I was writing this book, the role of our companies in prior strategic competitions has been very, very powerful. There was a wonderful book written by Arthur Herman called Freedom's Forge about how American business won World War II. And it presents a very strong case for how we basically, we think of it as the sleeping giant that awoke and basically, had so much industrial power and capability, but it's also American companies that provided that capability, and that once mobilized towards an undertaking of that scale, were able to do that and help the U.S. Win the Second World War decisively. And then in the Cold War, of course, we had these amazing technological advantages, and as much as that was produced by our innovation ecosystem absolutely included our ability to commercialize science and technology and use our massive market to create innovation. So we have had this amazing economic advantage in geopolitical contests in the past, and I think our companies today are going to be just as, if not even more important to this contest. They just don't know it yet. And I think that's going to be one of the big adjustments that we're going to, I think naturally make on some level. It's just an obvious response to this. It's sort of a necessary response. We need America's economic engines to ultimately be aligned to U.S. national security, and at the very least not to be against it. And H.R. McMaster wrote the foreword to my book and addressed it to the business leaders of the free world and laid out several things that you just don't want to do. I mean, don't be involved in the human rights abuses. Don't be involved in civil-military fusion. Don't be involved in Beijing's strategies that are designed for overtaking the United States. And part of why this is such a clear picture today, and that it's not simply the analogy of the Second World War or the Cold War, it's because China's companies, as you've mentioned, are very directly aligned, if not entirely directed, by the Communist Party of China. I mean, they use their companies directly in the service of their national interests and national strategies. They have, verbatim guidelines that I laid out in the book. I mean, all the big mega mergers that they're doing in strategic sectors. I mean, these are essentially state-backed, state-owned, or state-influenced corporations. So they use corporations as the fundamental instruments of their grand strategies. And for them to have essentially an economic armed forces, so to speak, and we have not yet even figured out the rules of engagement here, that's going to put us on the back foot for as long as it takes for us to realize how important business leaders, financial leaders, strategic industries, critical technologies, all of that is to winning this game. And yes, there is, I think, a victory that can be had, but it comes through economic competition and also utilizing that, obviously, to create the foundations for long-term deterrence.
You know, you say that many companies are effectively held hostage in China. I believe you use that term. I think that's accurate because extricating themselves would just be too much, too hard, too difficult. And, you know, I think actually now that I think about it, I saw something from, perhaps it was Volkswagen from Europe. They're saying, sorry, we're totally dependent on China. You know, this basically with the idea being that don't talk to us about, you know, de-risking or decoupling or anything like that. But basically, that's what containment is, right?
Yeah, and I think it's going to be different sector by sector, company by company. And a lot of this has to be resolved by corporate strategy. I mean, some of it is just how do you fundamentally de-risk or, you know, reduce exposure for any given corporate entity. I mean, they all have slightly different profiles in the China market. You know, some of it's revenue exposure, some of it's, you know, asset exposure, some of it's brand, you know, those sorts of reputational risks. But everybody's got a slightly different profile, but it basically tracks the same set of parameters. And I think on one hand, it's about government setting guardrails in terms of what can be done. And, you know, there are already initiatives, I think, that are starting to put that into place. But then it's also going to be corporate decision making at a board and C-suite level, you know, starting to realize that, look, maybe this may not be the market we think it is in the long run. Maybe some of the geopolitical risk means that our investment decisions or supply chain decisions are not as sound as we might have believed 5 years ago or certainly 10 years ago. So you're going to need an alignment. That's what I'd like to see. I mean, I think if we have people working consensually to make these decisions, not to imitate China's system where it's run by the state. We don't want that. I think we want free market capitalism to win this contest, but we are going to need some level of a reality check in boardrooms and C-suites where it comes to, you know, where is this competition ultimately going, and to also realize that the decisions they're making as business leaders in the People's Republic of China do have an effect on geopolitics. I mean, the more capital and technology that we're transferring over there, the more that we're basing supply chains that feed back to us and therefore, you know, putting us at risk as a country, and we're accruing all this systemic level risk as a country because of how we've engaged with China economically. And at the end of the day, I mean, fiduciary responsibility is about long-term preservation of capital and preservation of business interests. And those business interests in the long run in the People's Republic of China are going to be highly at risk. I mean, it's just not a sound picture. And I think that that's starting to change in the minds of corporate leaders when they have seen things, you know, the crackdowns on Hong Kong, you know, certainly Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, all of that started to bring geopolitics into the boardroom. But the levels of exposure to China can often be so mind-boggling for, you know, individual companies or sectors that they don't know what to do. So we're going to have to start working through that together, figuring out how to do it, find new markets to diversify to, new supply chains that are more secure, and new investment opportunities that come from the United States, because rebuilding this industrial base, securing our own supply chains, all of that will present opportunities.
You know, with all the talk of decoupling during the pandemic or following the pandemic, you know, I believe the CCP you know, actually threatened the medical supply, precursor supply chain, for example. That's a very, very obvious area of significant risk. From what I understand, Big Pharma has been fighting tooth and nail to prevent that from happening. There hasn't been a lot that's been reshored at this time, or friend-shored as they call it. I think you actually even say in the book, if I recall, that there hasn't been decoupling, essentially, like that's really happened. In fact, there's been maybe even more integration since that time. So I guess what I'm saying is, like, we've seen a lot of risk, and I do think that maybe is on people's minds, but just rubber meeting the road. We've seen these, you know, draconian lockdown policy, extreme draconian lockdown policies they had. We know the U.S. understands there's a genocide happening in Xinjiang, all sorts of crimes against humanity happening. There's all of this is the reality. Yet we're still deep in there. So what would it take? Is it, I mean, aside from reading your book, of course.
Well, sure. I mean, I think the United States tends to react to major issues based either on events or on foresight. And there are often people that can tell you what's going to happen. I mean, there are people that could explain Pearl Harbor or 9/11, and, you know, and then something happens and we react in a massive way as a country. So, you know, I think there are events at this point that people are aware of, and the possibility of CCP attack on Taiwan or another flashpoint in the region, I think is now being, much more closely watched and followed than it was in the past. But I think it's much better if we're able to do this just based on a sound sense of where we're going, what it takes to actually reposition ourselves in a way that will be sustainable, and to recognize that, I think we basically have to make a decision realizing that economic engagement has not brought the world we thought it would, and that it actually creates much more risk and a much more disadvantageous strategic position for the United States. And you've mentioned, post-pandemic or during the pandemic. I mean, that was another level of supply chain examination, certainly in the corporate sector, where the trade war back in 2018-19 really brought that to the boardroom. I think brought supply chains to the boardroom in a meaningful way, and then the pandemic brought was another wave of that, thinking how can we really secure this. And as you mentioned, the example which I use in the book was when the China Daily, I mean really the most official newspaper in the People's Republic of China, threatened to quote, toss America into the inferno of pneumonia if we ever withhold pharmaceutical ingredients or something to that effect. And that was ultimately brought up in Congress and is available in the Federal Register. I mean, that's how serious that moment is, to hear those kinds of threats. And of course, the current White House has listed pharmaceuticals as one of the 4 supply chains that need to be secured. So these are problems that I think we understand are on the table. I think it's going to take a little more strategic imagination, a little more comprehensive, more of a comprehensive approach to start to look at the entire picture. I think we have more of a general industrial-based problem than simply critical industries and emerging technologies. I think we need to have an allied industrial base that works, and that goes all the way into like 3rd and 4th tier supply chains and parts and components that tends to be a big bottleneck for people that are rethinking this issue. But at the same time, there's an enormous amount of investment that can be done. There are other nations that will work for these sorts of things over time, but it's going to require, I think, sustained focus at both a national and government level, but also at a corporate sort of long-term strategic thinking level. And the other element of this is asset owners. So really it's 3 parts. I mean, it's our government. It's when it comes to, I think, the economic decisions at hand, government, corporate leaders, and then also asset owners, meaning Wall Street, and those that actually are invested in these companies. So, typically, I mean, a lot of that is major pension funds or 401ks or these sorts of, investment vehicles that are, exposed to assets. And when people realize that China exposure is very risky and dangerous, and certainly in many cases dangerous to the US, to our allies, and to our geopolitical future, I think we can start to form a consensus that will allow us to figure out the right decision points and start to do things. And that's where we need to go.